Well, thank you very much for having me, Chris, and the center. It's especially meaningful to be back here, not only because I did my PhD here, but also to be sharing the stage with both Monica and Jane, whose work has played a role in how I think about the ideas in Stretch. And of course, I don't think I would have written the book had it not been Jane's encouragement. Everyone who knows Jane knows that she has a way of planting seeds in your mind, and this was a seed that she planted in my mind several years ago. And so thank you to both of you for having me be part of this today. I thought I would start by having you think about something important that you want to get done at work or outside of work. And then asking, suppose I came to you and I said, I'll give you a lot more time, money, and expertise to get it done. What would you say? Yeah, my sense is you'd say, of course you would. And that's because having more to do more is so embedded in how we think about things. You want to prop up a declining product, spend more on marketing. You want schools to be effective, hire more teachers. You want government to work better, increase the budget. You want to improve a relationship, buy an expensive gift.
That does work.
This is what I call chasing. And it's the idea that if we only had more, we can do more. And it's so ingrained in our society, but the question is, does it always work? Does it actually produce the best results? Does it make us feel the best? And when I found out the answer to those questions is no. But we often feel like we need to chase because we don't have an alternative. And that's where I came to stretching. Stretching is the simple but important shift in how we think about resources, whether it be time, connection, money, information. And it recognizes that it's what we do with what we have that matters the most. It's the psychology of resourcefulness. Now, when we think about resourcefulness, we tend to think of a strategy that might be used for someone who's fallen on hard times. Maybe they're poor, maybe they're just unlucky. And I learned a lot in my research about the remarkable way that people in these situations stretch. But my challenge to the rest of us who might be in more fortunate circumstances right now is to ask, do we have the courage to recognize that we often have more resources than we realize? Do we have the wherewithal to come up with different ways of using what we already have? And the answer that I learned to these questions as I was working on the book is yes. We overestimate what it is that we need to reach our true goals, and we have a tendency to underestimate the flexibility of the resources we use to get there. So what I'd like to share with you now is 5 different ways in which stretching is manifested, where there's great power in having less, and that how more actually turns out to be a myth. And it first starts with recognizing a stretching mindset. How do we realize that the resources around us are very changeable? Well, let's say we want to get a picture hung on the wall, and we don't have a hammer. Is our first instinct to go look for the hammer, or is it just to take the shoe that we're wearing and get the job done right away? When we're stretching, we realize that any resource is changeable. It's not fixed to a specific use. So we spend our effort trying to expand the possibilities of what we already have, as opposed to acquiring things that we don't have. Because when we're chasing, we exhaust ourselves, making comparisons to what our neighbors have, what our colleagues have, believing that we need these same things in order to be successful. As a result, we displace our goals, because our goals become focusing on getting more resources and not actually getting our goals done. So once we embrace this mindset that what we have is more than enough, and it's about how we think about that differently, we really can unlock that power of less and do more with what we have. So the first example I want to share with you is the power of constraints. In the land of chasing, constraints are really bad. That's because we judge the worth of ourselves and the worth of our projects based on the amount of resources that we have. Who's got the bigger budget? Who's got more ceiling tiles in their office? Well, it turns out that simply just thinking about constraints can make us more creative and innovative. So in one study, researchers divided a group of people randomly into 2 separate sections. One section was told to think about a time when they were a child and they had a lot. Call that the abundance group. Another group was told to think about a time when they didn't have a lot. Call that the scarcity group. Both groups were then given the same task. We have some extra bubble wrap that's left over from the computer lab. What can we do with it? Simply thinking about scarcity allowed people to come up with much more innovative and creative ideas than thinking about abundance. And the reason for this is simple. When we're surrounded by abundance, we default to the conventional way that we use resources. Yet when we think about and embrace scarcity, we give ourselves a license to do things differently and to think about those resources differently. Second, outsiders solve problems. And let me start this off with a preface that we hold experts in high esteem, and experts have an important place to play in our society. When someone comes to my office and they say, Dr. Sonenshein, I'm not feeling well, I tell them to go see a real doctor. But the question is, do experts always have the best solutions, especially when we're looking at complex problems? So in one study, which is a study of multiple studies, what we call a meta-analysis, it looked at over 11,000 observations to address a simple but important question. Does the amount of expertise, as measured by practice, predict performance, and to what extent in a variety of domains? When it came time to games such as chess, that relationship was, for social science standards, reasonably strong, although probably not as strong as you would expect. It was 26%. Music was 21%. Sports, 18%. This next one gives me pause as a professor. Education, 4%. Professional work, less than 1%. And there's a clear pattern going through here. As we go through activities that are more structured, where the rules of the game are static, to where the rules of the game are changing and the tasks are less structured, the role of expertise has a diminishing role on performance. And in fact, those activities, learning and working, are how we spend most of our lives. And as Monica says, 100,000 hours. In a second study, researchers looked across 10 different countries, 166 scientific labs, to answer the question as follows. To what extent does a scientist's knowledge in a domain predict the likelihood that they can solve a complex problem in that domain? And indeed, they found a strong relationship. The more scientific knowledge a scientist had in that domain negatively predicted how well they solved a problem in that domain. In other words, the chemistry scientist solved biologist problems better than the biologists themselves, and vice versa. The question is why? Why would knowing less actually end up with better results? Well, as outsiders, they approach problems differently. They have tools that aren't wedded to specific types of uses. So they're able to see problems in more innovative and creative ways and come up with solutions that experts with deeper knowledge in that area cannot come up with. 3, competition is your friend. One of the principles of stretching is trying to make unthinkable combinations, putting things together that you would never expect to go together. And if you look at the history of innovation, this is often what happens. So we're live streaming right now on Facebook. 10 years ago was the invention of the iPhone. What was it? You took a camera and you took a phone, you put them together, and you changed the way that most of us spend our waking lives, as well as most of how our children spend their waking lives, on the phone. Well, there's other unthinkable combinations we can make. And one of them that I realized in my research on gourmet food trucks is this notion of competition and friendship. So I spent several years researching gourmet food trucks. 15 pounds later, lots of interviews later, I found something that was truly remarkable. It's this notion that even though we're in such resource-constrained environments, and working on a food truck is a very tough environment, you're working maybe 18-hour days. This was done in Houston. It gets 130 degrees in the summer inside a metal tin box that's not bigger than many of our closets. You've got inferior cooking equipment. You're undercapitalized. You have very limited experience and no brand recognition. Sounds like a recipe for a disaster. Yet they create remarkable food, innovative cuisine, satisfaction for their workers, pride for their owners, and even profits. And so the question is, how can this whole industry that just exemplifies constraints do such remarkable things? Well, it came down to transforming what didn't seem like a resource at all, their competition, the other food trucks that are going for those same customers, those same scarce resources such as parking spots, and turning them into friends. Such that, let's say you're a pizza truck and you run out of mozzarella cheese, that's a pretty bad thing to do. One of your competitors will drop off cheese. You're selling cupcakes, a truck next to you is also selling cupcakes, and you run out of wrappers, you go borrow some wrappers. Your truck breaks down, one of your food truck friends comes to fix it. You have a bad week, you don't make a lot of money, other food trucks will start funneling you business so you can stay afloat. So it's about taking this thing that most people would consider a threat, competition, and turning it into the most valuable resource of all that makes this industry work, where you have this unthinkable combination, competition on one hand, because they do compete, but friendship on the other. 4, we are what we expect, and we live up to or down to those expectations. Let me tell you about a horse who's quite clever. His name was Hans. And in the 1890s, he dazzled crowds because he could do math. He could also read and spell, but we'll just talk about the math. You ask him what 4 plus 7 is, he'd tap his hoof 11 times. You ask him what 10 divided by 3 was, he'd tap his hoof 3 times, and then an extra time, of course, for the remainder. So no one could believe that this horse could do math. So a whole commission of so-called experts set out to investigate. It's the Hans Commission. They said, okay, let's separate the master from the horse. And it turns out Hans could still do his math problems. So they spent lots of time trying to figure this out, and they couldn't find anything. Indeed, Hans was quite clever. 2 more years would go by until someone trained as both a biologist and a psychologist finally cracked the mystery of how this horse can actually do math. Hans was clever, but he wasn't clever because he had the cognitive skills of math. He was clever because he was able to read people's expectations. And he knew when it was time to tap his hoof. Now, people are really good at reading expectations too, and we're signaling this all the time. Explicitly sometimes with our spoken words, implicitly with our body language, what type of assignments we give people at work. But the problem is, we often put the dunce cap on people. We set low expectations. And I know this firsthand. In 5th grade, which was a very hard time for me, I had terrible penmanship. I'm not gonna deny that. My teacher failed me the first 3 quarters, and the 4th quarter, she didn't even think I deserved a grade, so I didn't even get a grade. So I was below an F. And she told me, I would go nowhere because I couldn't have neat handwriting. As a result, my grades suffered in my other topics, and I was an absolutely terrible student. We often do this at work. We put the dunce cap on employees even before we meet them. We might hear about someone who's a jerk from a colleague, and then we interact with them in ways that treat them as a jerk. And lo and behold, they turn into that jerk. So the challenge when we're stretching is, can we actually replace the dunce cap with the competence cap? Can we expect more out of people? And what research shows is we can make children smarter, we can make workers more productive when we set those high expectations. And lo and behold, in 6th grade, I got higher expectations from my teacher, and I performed a lot better. I turned into a good student, and I'd like to think that that continued through my studies. 5th, we tend to think about our performances as based on what we plan and not what we do. And there's really something seductive about wanting to invest a lot of time and energy into planning. And I also learned this firsthand. The very first class I taught was here at the University of Michigan. It was an undergraduate introduction to management class. And I should have realized this at the time, but when you put participation in the syllabus, of course, everyone wants to participate. So I had lots and lots of hands going up in the room. So I thought a way of managing the crowd was to, say, you're going to talk, and then you're going to talk, you're going to talk, and I go around the room and maybe call on 6 or 7 people in that order and have them talk. And what would happen inevitably is I would get to maybe the 3rd or the 4th person, and with maybe the bravado that you would expect of an undergraduate business student here, they would confidently say what they thought was the most mind-boggling comment ever made in that class. And it actually tended usually to be a pretty good comment. But the problem was, everyone else in the room was cringing. And the student couldn't figure out, why is everyone looking at me so funny? Well, it turns out that they had repeated, almost verbatim, what the student in front of them had just said. And there's a name for this. It's called the next in line effect. And what happens is, when we're so busy planning our performances, we stop listening. In fact, we stop listening as much as 9 seconds before it's our turn to speak, and as much as 9 seconds after it's turn to speak. We're coming up with the best script of what to say, and then afterwards we're assessing, did we actually meet our plan? Same thing happens in meetings when our arbitrary place where we happen to sit dictates our speaking order. We're so busy planning that we end up missing how the conversation has evolved. And so when we're stretching, we try and get into a more improvisational mindset so we can be in the here and now. We can be present with what other people are saying and then make the most out of those comments, that information. So I thought I would leave you with one closing story that I think really exemplifies this improvisational mindset, but also exemplifies a lot of the principles of stretching. And it starts with this gentleman here who I'm guessing no one in the room recognizes. I'd be amazed. Anyone? You might know his name and you're surely familiar with his work. This is Dan Wyden, and he's an advertising executive. Dan Wyden was running a scrappy startup advertising agency one day. It was in the basement of a building because he couldn't afford better office space. He didn't have a regular phone. This is the era before cell phones. He used a payphone as the office phone, and he was under severe time constraints. One of his new clients was also a startup, needed an advertising slogan to unify some of its campaigns. And Wyden was struggling until at the last minute, he made a very unusual connection. He thought about a man by the name of Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore, to say the least, was not a very nice person. He was a lifelong criminal, and he had just committed what would turn out to be the last of his heinous crimes. He had brutally murdered 2 people. And Wyden was reflecting on this situation, and it gave him enough inspiration to do his work, and here's why. Unlike most people on death row, Gary Gilmore really wanted to die. His mother tried to intervene, and he told her to go away and not write any letters. Lots of religious organizations tried to step in, and Gilmore said, "No, I really want to die." So he finally got his wish, and his last words as he's in the death chamber were this: "Let's do it." That was enough for Wyden to create arguably the 3 most valuable words in advertising history. These words would go on and change not just Nike's prospects, but also the way that culturally we think about doing things. And what I love about this story is it really exemplifies three ideas I want to get across. The first is, you think about the environment in which Wyden created this slogan. He was constrained, he was under the gun with time, he wasn't in the fanciest office, and he came up with this. 2, he took what didn't seem like a valuable resource at all. I mean, this is something that a convicted, awful person came up with who killed people, and he turned it into the 3 most valuable words in advertising history. Although I'll tell you, I don't think you'll find this on the Nike homepage. And then the third is the message itself. This idea of just doing it. I mean, how many times do we say to ourselves, if I only had enough, if I had more time, or if I had more money, if I knew more, I could do more. This propels us not to wait until tomorrow to start doing things, but it propels us to start acting right now on what we have, right now with what we have. So the time to act is now. It's not to wait for more resources, to recognize that we often have more than enough that we need to meet our goals. So here's my final challenge to you. It's to recognize the abundance that we can create with what's right in front of us if we learn to use it in more creative and more innovative ways. It's the courage to realize that we often don't need to chase after the newest thing, what our neighbors have, what our colleagues have to meet our goals. It's the wherewithal to recognize that more is often a myth, that there's great power in less, and that the time right now is to stretch. Thank you.